This week, the Bush administration continues to ride an unprecedented popularity rating. But suddenly, there is a domestic issue that has the president on the defensive. The revelations about the underside of corporate America, or at least part of it. George Bush is in an Alice in Wonderland position. He's president with firm, some would say cozy ties to corporate associates and friends. But as one scandal follows another, he's had to act, delivering a tough-sounding speech the other day on Wall Street and vowing reforms and harsh punishments for the evildoers in the halls of finance and accountancy. Our panelists tonight are Elizabeth Kolbert, a writer for that esteemed comic weekly, The New Yorker; Stanley Crouch, an essayist, novelist, and columnist for the Daily News; in Washington, David Brooks, who's an editor of the Weekly Standard and the author of Bohos in Paradise; and in Mountain View, California, Christopher Hitchens, columnist for The Nation magazine and contributing editor for Vanity Fair. And finally, John Cassidy, a New Yorker writer on economics and the author of .con, a polemic aimed against the Wall Street of the late 1990s and the bubble that came after. John Cassidy, you've written about the economic disaster that led us to where we are now. You've called it a .con. To what degree are we in a disaster situation with corporate America because of what happened in the 90s? Set the table for us a bit about what happened, what led to Bush's speech this week.
Well, we're in the aftermath of the bursting of a speculative bubble. I mean, the 1990s was an unprecedented period in American history, an unprecedented stock market bubble. You know, $7–8 trillion of wealth was created. For a while, it seemed like anybody could get rich. It seemed like every American corporation was taking over its markets. America seemed to have invented a new economic model. And to some extent that was true, but a lot of it was just tied up with the stock market. And then at the start of 2000, the stock market crashed. And for the past 2 years, we've been basically dealing with the bursting of a speculative bubble and the after effects. It started off just with the dot-coms going broke. A lot of them went broke. Some of them still survive, like Yahoo and Amazon, but then nowhere near as valuable as they used to be. But what we've had in the last year, we found out that the excesses of the 90s weren't confined to the dot-coms and the internet companies. A lot of big companies like Enron, like WorldCom, like Tyco, were also doing suspect things in the 1990s, most of which were tied to the rising stock market.
Well, the old phrase was irrational exuberance, and
Right.
Now we seem to be something much darker is taking hold, that we're
Right.
talking about not just irrational exuberance, but thievery,
Right.
perfidy. To what extent does the scandal that's going on now have to do with just sheer out-and-out conscious dishonesty?
Well, there's been a lot of dishonesty, but a lot of the dishonesty was driven by the stock market. What happened was most of the executives in America in the 90s had enormous stock options or enormous stock packages. When they saw the stock prices rise, that made them very rich. They were suddenly worth hundreds of millions of dollars. So they had a massive incentive to do anything to keep the stock price up. The stock price wasn't justified by underlying earnings. So what they started doing was basically inventing earnings to try and keep the stock price up. And in scandal after scandal, that is the basic underlying pattern. Companies are refusing to tell the market that their earnings weren't real, so they started using accounting dodges, any sort of dodge, to keep the stock price up.
Suddenly the President of the United States seems to be awakening to this ever so slowly. He gave a speech a couple of days ago, Betsy. How sincere did that speech ring to you? What was in it that struck you as real reform, and how much of it was just kind of dodging a political bullet that was aimed at the midterm elections?
Well, I think in the last few days, events have already overtaken him, and this speech has been proved to be a pretty big failure, it seems to me, because you could see that Phil Gramm was quoted just yesterday as saying, in this environment, anything could pass. The Senate has already gone way beyond where the President was in his speech, and the House is expected to follow suit.
Well, where did he fall short?
He fell short in demanding, well, there are several areas in which people would say he fell short. He fell short in, for example, demanding that stock options be treated, in a way that would be reflected in the bottom line more honestly. And a lot of John McCain has called for that accounting reform, and we may well see that actually passed into law. And I think that from a political perspective, the Republicans are evidently on the run.
Stanley, is it a disaster for George Bush? Is there a disaster on the brink politically for the President?
I don't know if there's a disaster, but he may have to do what I call the whitewater walk. I mean, not only will he be called into question, but so will Cheney. And people will say, well, now you Republicans were willing to spend $70 million chasing the Clintons through the bush. We're going to have to look at you. And also, I think the Republicans, see, they never learn anything. I never get it from them. I mean, they make them same. They seem like they live in a little room somewhere, and somebody just slips things under the door and says, stock good, profit good. They seem like they never get it, that somewhere along the line there has to be a good relationship between the world of business and the society you live in. I mean, there are two groups of people. They seem to think there's one. That is, that if all four of us sitting here, and even great Hitchens out there in California, are, have a few $700–800 million apiece, we're the only people in the world. So if it does Cassidy some good, let's do it. If it does her some good, let's do it. If it does me some, if it does you some. Now, those other people out there, who the guys in the very expensive suits sitting in Washington, not wanting to answer questions right now, seem to have never heard of, they always come in last. But I think this time, that driven by Kane, by McCain, I think driven by the press and driven by the sanctimonious position that the party has often taken, they're really going to have to say, something that suggests that if you go to jail for selling crack, right, or if you go to jail for manslaughter for a long time, then we're going to do something about the fact that you just can't rip off $500 million or destroy something.
Well, I think the reason it has the potential to be so devastating is often you have scandals and often you have recessions or economic distress, but rarely do you have scandals that lead immediately to people's pocketbooks, people's pensions, everyone did become invested in the stock market in the 90s, and now everyone, including, Joe Main Street, is suffering. And if that can be linked somehow to the misdeeds of people who the Republicans will not take on, I think that's potentially very damaging.
Christopher, you beat up Clinton pretty hard on Whitewater, a scandal which most people barely remember what it was about. How vulnerable is President Bush now on the Harkin, the news about his, or the recycling of the news of a decade ago about his stock deal at Harkin? Where is he now? Is he, even despite his popularity ratings, is he in big trouble?
Well, I was thinking as Comrade Crouch was speaking about the Whitewater matter a moment ago that perhaps the Democrats will now regret having destroyed the Independent Counsel statute, because it won't be there for the revenge that they might want to meditate. I mean, the best revenge, I think, would be for the Democrats to point out how much fun it would have been if Social Security had been put into the stock market by now. I think that's a point that might register with people. I'm talking to you from the still gently smouldering ruins of Silicon Valley, where actually this inquiry has been going on for a bit longer. It's been a year or so now since you could get a table in a restaurant here or park your car, which used to be impossible. And what it reminds me of, basically, is organized crime. It was that not just that there were a lot of people doing it, but that the cops were in on it. In other words, the regulatory authorities were in on it. They knew they'd been taken care of. The people who were supposed to be the accountants knew about it. I think also quite a number of journalists were complicit in it, since we ought to not exempt our own great profession. There were a lot of people making tips they knew were false, writing boosterish articles and so forth. And until the divine Miss Bethany McLean, I think it was, of Fortune, sort of asked the kids question as the emperor goes by, how does this company make its money? Where does this all come from?
I should tell you
everyone wanted it to go on forever because it was a great casino where it appeared nobody could lose.
I'd like to go back to the president himself just for 1 minute. Paul Krugman wrote in the New York Times this morning a column that basically, in the old phrase, connected the dots of the president's own personal fortune. And the Harkin deal led eventually to the buying of shares in a baseball team and then the sale of the baseball team, and voila, through personal connection and what other alchemy there's possible, you have a rich man whose father at that time was also president of the United States.
Right.
Is the President of the United States dishonest? Stanley Crouch.
Well, I don't think we really know yet. I think, but you see, that's what I think is going to be the issue that he's going to have to deal with. That's what I meant earlier when I said the Whitewater Walk. I think that there's going to be so much attention, there's going to be so much detail that's going to come forward. Like what she was talking about is about the fact that often the public is not like us. They don't read everything about everybody, put it in files, and then say, oh, yeah, well, you remember 2 years ago he had said so-and-so. What the way the public finds out is when all of this attention comes to David Remnick or to Stanley Crouch, and then all of that other stuff gets pulled back out. Then we ask all of that again. Then people upset on you, you know, some would say like piranha, and eventually, you know, you're stripped down. They say, I think the bones in there are rotten. Well, we'll find out, right? Okay, now the thing I'm saying is this. This is what Whitewater set up. This is part of our tradition. And we finally have to look at it. See, American capitalism is about one thing over and over and over in terms of how it affects the country at large. That is, can you bring profit, can you bring the profit motive and morality together? That's what this country is about. So it doesn't mean, like the example I always say, the issue of slavery wasn't you can't have people working on your plantations. The issue was you can't own them. So what we're going to see as this comes forward is the Republicans have often presented the successful businessman, the business innovator, even the seeming whale who swallows everybody up as a good fish. Now, I think that what the public is going to find out over the next year, and this is not going to be a short run, because there's going to be so much, because there's going to be so much pressure, and when real sentences, just like in Watergate, start getting pointed at people, we're going to find out a lot of stuff that none of us at this table probably could imagine about how certain things actually are done. And they'll be shaking confidence, and whomever was on the right side will come forward and say, due to our camp crusade, we got them out of there.
Christopher?
Well, I was just going to say to Stanley that actually a whale isn't a fish, it's a mammal. And if you're going to accuse, and a big mammal at that, and if you're going to accuse, in order to convict Bush of dishonesty, you'd have to say that he consciously broke some rule, filed some false return, made some false declaration, did something of that sort, or did some insider trading. There's no reason to think that he did, and that's actually what, in the favorite phrase of mine coined by Mike Kinsley, actually to describe life in Washington, but it goes for Wall Street too, the scandal is not what's illegal, the scandal is what is legal. Bush was probably amazed when his advisors told him, hey, you can do all this. You're not creating any wealth, you're not manufacturing any products, you're not meeting any need, you're not doing any of the things capitalism is supposed to do, but you can make a ton of money and enhance your holdings this way. He said, wow, I didn't know I could do that.
John, you wanted to jump in.
I was just going to say, I mean, it may be that he didn't do anything illegal, but we're not sure about that yet. You do have to prove intent, which I think is what Christopher is referring to, and that's very difficult.
John, lay it out for us. What's the deal? What's potentially a disaster for Bush legally as opposed to just
politically? It doesn't look like he's under any legal threat now, because the SEC did investigate all this stuff a decade ago.
Being what? What could he have done?
Well, it's basically...
What did they investigate?
It was insider dealing, but not in the sense of insider dealing in somebody gives you a tip on a stock and you sell the stock like Martha Stewart is accused of. We don't know whether she did it, but that's what she's accused of. This was more subtle. Bush had a small energy company called Spectrum 7, I think, which he sold to another energy company called Harken Energy. That was a legitimate deal. Didn't seem to be anything wrong with it there. They gave him, in return for his company, they gave him some stock in Harken, so he's a stockholder. Then there are two transactions involving Harken Energy, which is what the fuss is all about. One is that Harken Energy was in trouble, and Bush sold some stock before they made a bad news announcement. And he didn't file the requisite form with the SEC to say that he'd sold the stock.
Right.
That is sort of, it's not insider dealing, but it's a technical violation of the law. The second thing is, doesn't really concern Bush directly, but the company did a very suspicious accounting dodge to inflate earnings. They sold part of the company to a related company and said it was an outside deal. That inflated their earnings, made the company look in better shape than it was. Now, that doesn't seem a big deal. It's 15 years ago, but it's exactly the same sort of thing that Enron was doing, that WorldCom was doing, that Tyco was doing.
So why isn't that a big deal politically?
Well, because I think most people don't understand about it, don't know the details. As Stanley says, most people don't read the details in every column, but, you know, as you say, Paul Krugman's banging away about it in the New York Times. I think the Democrats are picking up on it on the Hill. You know, I think once people do I think that's why Bush looked so uncomfortable at the press conference the other day. I mean, I don't think I've ever seen him look that uncomfortable, because he knows this is his Achilles heel. How did he make his money, you know? And it's not just him, you know, you've got Cheney.
Didn't he vaguely know at the time of the election? Didn't everybody know? Wasn't it spelled out by David Brooks about his baseball team and by all of us?
Absolutely, and you might recall that he had a little trouble in that election. So I do think that, you know, you have to be very... I mean, once again, the polls may be great, and I may be completely wrong, but if I were a Republican strategist, I would be sitting there thinking, this is my vulnerability. What could be worse? I have all these corporate insiders. I have the Secretary of the Army. I have Dick Cheney sitting there. I have every single one of them has a potential, certainly a potential conflict of interest. Some have potential, real legal problems, and that was always my vulnerability. What could be worse than a stock market meltdown, to point that out?
Mm-hmm. David Brooks, just a sec, Christopher. David Brooks in Washington. How bad can this get for President Bush, or is this something that's going to blow away in a couple of weeks? What is the White House sense of this as a real crisis, or is just a crisis du jour?
I think they do have this fear about that people decide the country's going in the wrong direction, and they do have a fear that there'll be some sort of set of institutional doubts. The question, though, is whether the Democrats are morons or intelligent in thinking they shouldn't make hay about this. They are very sure that they do not come off looking anti-business. They don't want to be seen as the party that is against the businessman, because while in the Upper West Side biosphere there might be an entity called the businessman who does this and who does that, for most of America, the business is what they do. Most of America is in the private sector. They didn't need this to know that some business people were scoundrels and some are pretty good people. And so they do not react to this in a generalized way. Mm-hmm. They don't react, the business class is here, the Republicans are part of the business class, therefore this spills over to the business class. That's not what
David,
the
I
polls
should
show.
tell you, as a resident of the People's Republic of the Upper West Side, there are more business people there than intellectuals or other communists.
But they wish they were intellectuals, and they don't wear tasseled loafers.
Tassels are kind of out now, David. But Stanley.
Well, I think that this is going to be a grand opportunity for somebody who's smart enough to clarify what I was talking about earlier. See, the profit motive profit and ethics can go together. Mm-hmm. It's not an automatic thing that because you're a businessman, you're a crook. Because you've amassed a large fortune, that it's insider trading, mob. It's not always that either. But I think that what's going to be important here is to find out, as Cassidy was saying earlier, what did happen, and why does it happen, and how do these things? What is the consistency of it, and is there a way that we can move without going over the cliff, as we tend to in our country, against this kind of stuff, without harming the people who aren't crooks?
Well, John, what has to be done to eliminate these abuses legislatively? What has to be done to make sure that this doesn't happen again? And did Bush's speech go far enough in your view?
Well, I could give a 2-hour speech on that question, but there are various obvious things which could be done which Bush didn't endorse. One, which Betsy referred to, is making stock options an expense. Stock options are at the middle of all this. They give a big incentive to businessmen to be crooked. They also, And
why didn't Bush put a stop to that? Why didn't he start counting stock options or introduce the notion of putting stock options as something that has to be put against profits?
Well, I think the only reason I can think of is a political reason. That the Republican Party is the party of big business, and big businessmen don't want this to happen. I mean, there have been moves to expense options for years. Arthur Levitt, the former chairman of the SEC, I think, supported it. Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, has supported it. Most academics support it. But, businessmen don't want it because it's a great deal for them. They basically get free money at the moment. You get a big chunk of options, and it's not counted against earnings. Now, there's no such thing as free money.
Calling for that?
Milton Friedman taught us that years ago.
Christopher asked the right question. Are the Democrats calling for it as well?
The Democrats weren't really calling for it, no, because, as Christopher says, a lot of them were in bed with big business as well and didn't want to be seen as against big business. Some of them are calling for it now. I mean, John McCain is calling for it on the front pages of the papers.
David, the president doesn't seem to be in any near-term trouble of being accused of serious crimes. On the other hand, Vice President Cheney was CEO of Halliburton at a time when it seems that accounting games were being played, in the same way that Kenneth Lay was CEO when accounting games were being played at Enron. What's the difference, and why isn't Dick Cheney in serious trouble? Why don't we suspect that very tough times are ahead for the vice president?
It's possible. I think one of the things holding that scandal back is that it's being initiated by a guy named Larry Klayman, who was sort of considered sort of an oddball and a kook. He files a lot of lawsuits he did against Bill Clinton and hounded him quite viciously. He's now, I think, suing the Iraqis for the Oklahoma City bombing. He's the one suing Dick Cheney.
But let's take Larry Klayman out of the equation. Larry Klayman has sued everybody. In fact, it seems half my staff was sued at one time or another. You're right to point that out. But the problem itself remains, doesn't it?
Yeah, and there clearly is a problem, and Bush, with his loans, which he took from Harkin, is a victim of this too. That things that were acceptable in the 90s are now unacceptable, and now that we've learned what they can what they can lead to. So if there were the sort of auditing and accounting irregularities at Halliburton or Harkin that we've seen in a grander and more vicious scale, then that will reflect backwards on these figures. Though it should be said that the SEC has not yet looked into Halliburton. They did look into Harkin, Democratic analysts at the SEC, and found nothing wrong.
Christopher, to wrap this up for us, where do you think this is going to go?
Well, I was just wondering if we're right to confine it to the 90s, because if you remember with Whitewater, the initial interest in that was it was an aspect of the savings and loan scandal, which was gigantic and again involved a lot of ordinary Americans being ripped off by a lot of hard-faced or fat-faced guys. That was predicted to be a great scandal too, and never was, because no one could ever assign the responsibility properly. And you can be left with generalities like the one from Balzac, about how every great fortune is founded on a great crime. I think that the absence of any political or ideological or cultural fallout from it so far tells us a great deal.
I want to thank you all. I appreciate it. Good night.